Jesus BMX riding Christ doing a wheelie, look at this motherfucking unit. Hello and welcome to this review of my Hyper7 Round 4 keyboard. This was a donation from mechboards.co.uk. Thanks guys. They also sent me the previous Round 3 version that I reviewed a while ago. I've really been looking forward to doing this video, so much so that I dedicated a trailer video to this keyboard. So let's get started. The Hyper7 is a keyboard originally designed by Yankar, and at first it was intended as a DIY project. Here I have a set of original Hyper7 PCBs. They're completely empty, they have no components or anything on them. Apart from all this soldering, you needed to make your own chassis. I mean, it's not like there was anything out there that you could buy that would fit this. You had to make your own plate if you wanted one, and most challengingly, you needed the proper keycaps, of which there were a few sets made, but those quickly became complete unobtainium. A fully completed original Hyper7 is not just a hell of a collector's piece, but a true testament to perseverance. The Round 3 version was an initiative from Mechboards to produce the Hyper7 in a package that didn't require such a tremendous amount of hard work. They provided a chassis, plate, stabs, assembled PCB, and even a keycap set they had made, so this put the Hyper7 within reach of actual human beings. I reviewed that one, and it was fantastic, but it did have a few flaws, and some things it could seriously improve on. And, to my pleasant surprise, they did a new version, which is this Round 4 one, where they basically did absolutely everything I asked for, so that's really nice. I've been in close contact with them about this project for a while, because I obviously wanted to know when it was going to come out, and although it was massively delayed, I had originally intended to make this my end-of-year video from last year, I'm glad they took their time to do things properly and not rush it. With a project as ambitious as this, you're of course bound to hit a bunch of snags along the way, and it's easy to cut corners or mess things up, which would be very unfortunate for such a cool board. Not to mention it would be rather outrageous considering the keyboard's inevitably sizable price tag. The most visually obvious change is the addition of an actual case this time, rather than a floating switch-style plate-only design of Round 3, although you can still get it like this as well. The case costs an extra €130, but it does elevate the weight from 3.15 kilos, which is already an insane amount, to a full 5 kilos. That's the weight of 2.5 IBM Model M keyboards combined, or 25% more than a Model F battleship. It's also bigger than a battleship at 59.5 centimeters wide compared to the F-122's 56, and that's not even talking about the amount of keys. The battleship of course has 122, whereas this one comes in at 183, and there are older versions out there where these double keys are all single keys instead, which brings it to 213 keys, more than twice the amount of keys on a standard full-size keyboard. It's an aircraft carrier. Now, with a 59.5 by 22 centimeter footprint, or in imperial units, how do y'all buy like totally dude stone's throws, this obviously takes up an enormous amount of desk space. In fact, I can barely fit it in frame, and I can already hear the people crying in the comments about mouse space. But the thing is, the vast majority of extra space is actually taken up at the top and at the left rather than the right, and so I found that this really doesn't intrude on your mouse space much at all. In fact, it's missing the nav cluster here when you think about it. Now, when you're using this cluster on the left here, your left arm is a bit more to the side than normal, but I really didn't find this an issue at all, and that's coming from someone who's got lots of problems with their left shoulder. Now, not only is this thing fucking huge, but this big-ass behemoth is not made out of junk either. The whole chassis and case is made out of plate steel, no silly aluminium rubbish here. It even comes with a carrying handle at the back, which significantly reduces its felt weight compared to holding it at the sides like a normal keyboard. Thankfully, you can flip the handle down when not needed, and in either position it locks into place. Nice. Now, because of the nature of bent sheet steel, they warned me in advance that it's impossible to make it completely gapless. They mentioned that mine had about average-sized gaps. Some were better, others were worse. It's just one of the limitations of the material, I guess. Honestly, I don't mind this at all. After all, you can still get the plate-only version anyway if this really bothers you. Another small but useful inclusion this time that I asked for in round 3 is the addition of hot swap sockets. The previous version didn't have them, and although I'm pretty practiced at soldering by now, soldering in so many switches is a bit of a job, let alone desoldering them all and soldering in new ones if you want to change. So this is a simple but very welcome addition. Another thing I commented on in round 3 was that the board used a uniform 0.5 unit stagger, unlike the varying one that's on normal keyboards. Thankfully, they added an option for a modern layout that incorporates this, as well as a normal single-piece spacebar, rather than the 5-part one on the previous version. That one was a bit much even for me. You can still get this classic layout from their website as well, but I'm really glad they included the option to forgo this and go for a more conventional layout. I mean, it's not like the keyboard doesn't take some getting used to already anyway. Another change is the keycaps. Rather than coming with DSA ferrous caps like the previous version did, it now comes with this black, white and blue color scheme instead, which I think looks much nicer. They are reverse die-sub PBT. They went with this rather than double shots to suppress the already huge costs of the keyboard. There was a short, independent rerun of Space Cadet double shots organized by BitShifter in anticipation of this project, but those are £300 per set, and so they decided to go with a cheaper set as a standard so the people who wanted the luxury sets could buy them themselves. I tried to arrange one of those sets to show off for you guys, but understandably he couldn't spare a free set since BitShifter isn't a commercial guy, he's just a group buy organizer. That said, what I don't understand is why MechBoards didn't offer this cheaper set in Space Cadet colors, because I think that's the color set you want with it. Not just because the Hyper7 was inspired by the Space Cadet keyboard, but also because it just looks completely kick-ass, and it suits this board in particular to boot. They mentioned something about not wanting to step on the group buy organizer's toes or something like that. Basically, it sounded very courteous, but goddammit, Space Cadet. Make one already, for fuck's sake. Still, even though I keep calling these caps cheap, die-sub PBT is very durable and these should last you basically forever. It is cheaper to make them like this than double shots would be, but it's not like they're sending you crap or anything. It's still very high quality materials and printing. Finally, one of the biggest changes, at least for me, is that this new version is now compatible with VIA and Vial straight out of the box. The previous rounds were only compatible with QMK, and the original Hyper7 is a pretty old project by now, so much so that the modern QMK shortcuts and stuff didn't work with it, and there was no Hyper7 file in the QMK repository, so you couldn't use the QMK configurator tool, for example. The previous time, it took me and someone who was quite experienced with QMK 2 hours to even just get it set up for programming, of which I had done nothing yet at that point. Naturally, a fair amount of frustration and loud swearing occurred. By contrast, with this version, you can just connect to the VIA site, or Vial, whichever you prefer, and you can start customizing it right away. So now as child's play, I'd say that's a big win right there. Programmability is especially important on this particular keyboard, way more so than on almost any other model, because this thing is very much made to be customized. The default layout isn't too crazy or anything, but all this stuff here is just begging to be reprogrammed with keys, shortcuts, macros, etc. This is more or less the entire point of the keyboard. It's also why it's nice that they used uniprofile keycaps on it, that way you can swap them around on other rows without it looking ridiculous. Anyway, thankfully, like I said, with VIA or Vial, reprogramming this thing is now a piece of piss. Now, the potential benefit to a workflow that this many macro keys brings to the table is just huge. For my work alone, for example, I can envision a metric fuckton of applications, part numbers, merchant codes, location entries, shortcuts, etc., etc. When I was a PhD student, I even programmed my entire login into a macro key once, username, tab, password, enter, though I don't think I can get away with that in my current position. But while a keyboard like this is stereotypically associated with work, I wanted to test it out during gaming as well, because when you have this many keys to work with, there's no reason its usefulness should be limited to office work. And so I played some Diablo 2, which in its default key configuration, which I've been playing with for almost 23 years now, has a pretty chaotic control layout even for a normal keyboard, let alone this one. It's very reliant on the Alt and Shift buttons, as well as the number keys and F keys, with the Control and I keys also being of common use, plus a few others. So I took this control scheme, which I knew was going to be very difficult to use on the default layout of this board, in particular because the standard configuration has the F keys here on the left, and I played an Iron Maiden Necro build, which is a non-competitive build that has to use quite a lot of key commands, so a pretty challenging choice overall, and got to working. And, of course, it's a nightmare having to keep switching with your hand between this cluster, this one, and this one, let alone combinations of them, but basically I just started with the F keys here and started making on-the-fly adjustments, adding more keys on positions that my fingers were resting on, and within half an hour I had come up with this, and the layout was so fast and felt so natural that I'd actually played a lot faster with it than I did with the standard keyboard, and that's not even with changing the control scheme inside the game itself. And this is not even because of ergonomics or ortholinear or any of that bullshit, it's just through sheer weight of keys and deep, easy on-the-fly customizability. You can just put the keys that you need in a finger's reach and there you go. It couldn't be easier. And you can do this for different games individually, of course. Now, I'm not trying to advocate this as an ultimate gaming keyboard or anything, I'm just pointing out what the possibilities are if you have so much space and so many keys. Just go nuts and configure the hell out of it to suit whatever needs you might have. Now, of course, there are some negatives to the keyboard. The disassembly is quite complicated, especially on this prototype, as the screw sockets come loose on this version, making attaching the chassis to the case a much fiddlier affair than it should be. That should be fixed on the production version, though, I've been told. It's also very easy to reassemble it in a way that doesn't work properly because the PCB isn't held in place by the case. The switches are the only thing that's holding the PCB where it is. So if you remove all of them, the PCB is just going to drop down into the case. They warned me about this in advance, so I wanted to test out how bad it was, plus I needed a bunch of assembly shots for my trailer anyway, so I tried it out, and once the PCB becomes loose-ish, it's difficult to put the switches back in without them pushing the PCB out of the way, so you'll get switches that won't make contact properly. It's not too difficult to avoid these issues if you know in which precise order to reassemble the keyboard, and apparently they're already working on an instruction video that shows how to do it most efficiently, but it's something to keep in mind. Of course, the plate version doesn't have a space below the PCB, so it's much easier to assemble, and the PCB won't fall out, so that's a much more foolproof version in this regard. This one also avoids the minor issue of this slightly flexy bit of plate that spans over the middle of the keyboard on the case version. Finally, and this is not a comment about the execution of this round, but just a remark in general about the Hyper7, this is a very big, very expensive, very high-end piece of specialist equipment. Though it's beyond question a really cool keyboard, if you're not intending to use it and program it to get something out of all of these keys, they're just going to be in the way, and so they become a negative rather than a positive. And then it's just a really large, really awesome, really costly paperweight. So think before you buy one. The keyboard is available in a wide variety of configurations with wildly varying costs. This version, with everything included, keycaps, stabilizers, switches, and don't forget there are a lot of all of those on this keyboard, and fully assembled and I think even lubed, is the most expensive version at almost $1,000. But the most bare bones version, which is just a chassis really, of the plate version is less than $400. It's still a lot of money, and you'll have to get all the parts somewhere else, so it's going to cost you regardless, but still you can make it more or less luxurious depending on your needs. The case version is €130 more than the plate version, and painting either version costs another €70. So the difference between a painted case like this and a bare steel plate chassis like that is around €200, an easy save if you don't care too much about the housing. They sell a fairly large variety of switches with it, more in a bit about the switches I picked for this particular build. This is something many people might actually have lying around already, so that doesn't necessarily give you extra costs. Just keep in mind you'll need as many as 183 of them. Mechboards charge €44 for a set of Gatorons, 108 for a set of Cherries, and the most expensive option is Gatoron Ink Silent Black at €210. There are other choices as well, including Box Jade, which probably would have been my choice if I hadn't wanted to review a switch type I hadn't covered before yet. Anything for you guys? A set of stabilizers ranges from €67 to €142 depending on the type you want. I know it sounds like a lot, but keep in mind that the full set ships with 34 2-unit stabilizers and one 7-unit spacebar stab, so in the end the unit price isn't even that high. The keycaps are €78 for the included cheap set. Like I said, the other group buy was £300, and I'm really not sure how you're going to escape this cost unless you already have a Hyper7 set, and even then you need to be careful with the layout you choose, because the modern layout standard, stagger and spacebar result in one or two different key sizes from the classic layout, so don't forget that. And finally, assembly is €78, and with stab lubing, again there are a lot of them, it's €143. So basically you can make it very expensive, but you can also save out on a lot of these things. Next up, a word on the switches. I went with Cherry New Nixies for this build. Now, it's important to note that these really have nothing to do with the Hyper7. I just picked these because I hadn't covered them yet and wanted to explore what they were like to tell you guys about them, but I could have, of course, put anything in them if I wanted to. New Nixies are Cherry-made repros of a very old switch type Cherry used to custom make for a company called Nixdorf, hence the name, with these new ones having some added modern amenities like being able to get them pre-lubed. The original Nixies were basically MX black switches from the vintage black period, except they had transparent top housings, and they were only found in a few boards. They were extremely hyped and commanded very high prices at the time. I reviewed this keyboard, the Nixdorf CT06 soft keys, which are nicknamed the Nuclear Nixdorf on account of its colossal size and 5 key tumblers at the top here. And this had original Nixies in it, and I found that the switches were smoother than normal MX blacks, but basically the same as other vintage blacks, which I've also reviewed on several occasions, by the way. So there was no need to completely overhype these old Nixie switches, even if they were better than bog standard ones. But these new Nixies are found to be very bad. Perhaps it's because of late I keep getting pampered with ultra-light contactless Hall effect switches with keystrokes as smooth as a baby's bottom, but these felt scratchy and way too stiff. It was quite uncomfortable using them for extended periods of time actually, and I'm definitely going to change them over for something else when this review is finished. They feel worse than the original Nixies too. They feel scratchier, though they bind less, which is probably a condition thing. I'm not a believer in cherry boards needing to be broken in. I think that's just fanboy talk for getting used to the shitness. I've owned dozens and dozens of MX black keyboards of varying ages and conditions, which I found at the recycling centers, and in my experience, more well-used boards do not necessarily feel smoother than lesser used ones. If anything, I'd say it's the opposite. The sound isn't great either. In a big hollow case like this, you need something that sounds good because it's going to amplify the typing noise, but these just give a typical powdery, scratchy cherry reverb. I should say that the keyboard comes with some foam loosely packed in there by default. I left it out for this review. The spacebar also sounds rather bad, so Mechboards gave me some modded ones. This one is stuffed with blue tack, which you'll be hearing in the typing demo, and they also gave me one with some foam slung under it, both in an attempt to shut it up a bit. Probably I would have gone with something that actually felt and sounded good, like Jade's, if I didn't want to review these new Nixies, but hey, you win some, you lose some, it's all the same to me. With the new hot swap sockets, it's easy enough to change them out anyway. overall, I think this is a fantastic keyboard. MechBoards really did a great job on this project, and even though they had a few setbacks, they pulled through and they made it good. Like I said, it's a keyboard with a purpose, and even in its cheapest form, it's still a very expensive piece of kit, but my god, you are getting an awful lot of keyboard for it, let's be honest. Plus, I have very little I can actually fault it for, which isn't that weird considering they addressed every single concern I had with the previous round. You know, I don't even think the price is unreasonable. I'm sure I couldn't do it for less than they did. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.